I'll go ahead and get started. I first want to begin by thanking Dr. Christy Williams for extending to me this invitation to participate in this diversity and inclusion faculty development series. I really appreciate that, Christy. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Lisa Brown, and I'm the second faculty diversity fellow here at Ursuline College. And so what I plan to do is talk about civic engagement and social justice learning implemented as foundational college curriculum. And in order to do that, I took this as an occasion to share with you all about my research that I did on civic engagement within the context of Chile. So my plan is, in terms of this workshop format, is to do a presentation of my civic engagement research, and then for us to get into a small breakout groups and have some respond to the discussion prompts that I prepared. And then the last part, I will talk about my findings and its implications for the goal of civic engagement as foundational college curriculum. So September 11 conjures in the minds of most Americans the terrible date of the terrorist act that destroyed the Twin Towers in New York and a number of people's lives. But September 11th also holds a special day of tragedy for the people of Chile, because in 1973, a military coup d'etat took place in Chile where Commander Augusto Pinochet unseated the democratically elected President Salvador Allende. Allende was a Marxist and a physician, and Salvador Allende was his military general at the time. The pro-privatization dictatorship of Pinochet abolished what had previously been free public education for all Chilean citizens. Now, in 1980, Pinochet enacted a constitutional law, acronym LOCI, that led to the privatization of higher education. And in 2011, a student movement and opposition to the privatization of higher education in Chile hit its peak, and it was dubbed the Chilean Winter. And what you saw is students in uprisings in opposition to the country's support of private for-profit education. And let me add this caveat. Profiteering in education in Chile is illegal technically, but it still occurs anyway. So in Chile, you have this organizational structure of traditional public universities, which has a membership of about 27 traditional Chilean institutions. But there are hundreds of privatized institutions, and most of them operate under the auspices of what the students felt was profiteering. So these students were in protest to that form of educational exploitation and the rising costs. Similar to what we saw in the United States with some of the private for-profit universities like the DeVries and some of these little fly-by-night institutes, they were extending to students these really, really expensive loans, who a lot of times, particularly among the poorer Chileans, who couldn't complete the degrees in a timely manner, ended up saddled with all this debt and worse for wear by not having the degree. So the students wanted the pressure relieved in terms of that, and they protested who at the time was President Sebastián Piñera, who was a part of the Conservative Party. So in 2011, Chilean student protesters demand a return to free education and a retrenchment of that expensive private for-profit education. And the candidate they backed was Michelle Bachelet. Michelle Bachelet is the daughter of Salvador Allende, and I believe first cousin of Elizabeth Allende, who recently won the Anderson Wolf Book Award here in Cleveland. And so under the leadership of Michelle Bachelet in 2016, she implemented the first phases of returning Chile back to free education for the lowest income of 30% of Chilean citizens. In any event, I said this is a perfect place for me to do my study, because I had been looking at the phenomenon of privatized education in large part due to my experience as a teacher in the Columbus Public School system. And those students were actually my motivation for going back to work on my PhD. So I was a science teacher in Columbus Public Schools, and I kept seeing some of my students bright-eyed and excited about their pending graduation and acceptance to college. They had shared with me how they were going to be computer science majors and nurses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I am not a dream killer, but these are some of my students who struggle academically in the courses that I taught, like science and biology. And I would ask them, I said, where are you going to school? I got accepted at DeVry. I got accepted at some other institute, which was a private for-profit university. So I was concerned about that. And so when I went back to work on my PhD at University of Georgia, I started to look at the literature and the information that was available. And what I was finding is that there were some very exploitative practices happening among minority populations because they had this high income need level, and so they were able to get all of these grants and loans, which they got up front, which the private for-profit universities found attractive. And these same students did not have the academic preparation to be successful, and or the structure of the institution was such that you had nursing students who never set foot inside of a hospital for a clinical. So there was a bit of an exploitation taking place there. Now, Obama later on instituted gainful employment metrics that these institutions had to abide by. So many of them went the side, kind of like off to the side and folded. But some may be, the gymnastic administrative permutations needed in order to continue to get these monies. So I was interested in seeing the difference between those students who went to these private for-profit universities versus the traditional public university. And so I used civic engagement as my phenomenon of emphasis and study. I also was concerned about the direction of our country as it relates to politics and how I felt like our attention to obtaining a degree seemed to supersede our need to become educated global citizens. So, in conjunction with my advisor, we agreed that civic engagement would be my phenomenon study. So when I found out all of this action was happening in Chile, and I actually had a test situation already set up where this country had for almost 40 years been under the auspices of a privatized system, I said, this is perfect. Then I was like, how am I going to get to Chile? So I filled out all these food right applications, the Spencer Foundation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I didn't get one. So I was just like so demoralized, and I was like, oh my God, how am I going to do this research? This is so important. Maybe it's too political. Maybe I should tone it down. But thanks be to God, one lady saw my plea for assistance, who was in fact a Fulbright scholar who was already in Chile. And she wrote me back and told me she was very, very interested in my study, that if I would come down there, she'd make sure that I had somewhere to stay, and she supported my research. And I was extended a visiting scholar opportunity at the Universidad Católica del Maule in Talca. So I went to Chile, and I'm like, yay, so I can do my research. So when I arrived, Chile was in a state of evolution and revolution. But that is always the state in Chile from what I found out. But at the time, September 11th was the 40th anniversary of the Pinochet coup. And so I arrived like at the beginning of September. So we got this email from the State Department telling us, Americans, you are to stay out of the streets on September 11th. It can be very, very dangerous. So I'm conflicted between my adventurous spirit and at the same time wanting to come back in a, whole to my family. So I was in Talca, and I was expecting all this, ruckus, and September 11th came and went in Talca. Now there were more activities in Santiago, but in the city that I was in, there was nothing along the lines of the Molotov cocktails and water cannons that you had seen in Santiago. But what was interesting, when I first arrived, I kind of like explored around downtown Santiago, and I saw all of these protests going on, and I saw that the Chilean people were very revolutionary people, particularly the younger students and the millennials. And so this one was a protest about wanting to preserve water safety at one of the nearby lakes. And here was on the campus of the University of Chile, where they had this mural that was very, adamant about how education was their right, and that they would fight and protect their interest to have, education available to all Chileans. So Chile had this revolutionary activity going on, so they had all the ingredients, plus a very attractive media darling named Camila Vallejos. Now, Camila was a very, very smart woman. She had been the daughter of two activist communist parents who resisted the Pinochet regime back in the day, and she has subsequently gone on to become a member of the Chilean Congress. But she was the face and the leader of this university student protest movement. So they had all the ingredients to try and make change in the country. So the student activism movement, as I said, was called the Chilean Winter phenomenon. And I used that environment, that occasion, that idea in support of my research to examine the civic engagement that was happening in the country. And I specifically looked at the civic engagement that was happening in the student impact between those who were at the public university and those who were at the private for-profit universities. And so the first thing I needed to do is define civic engagement, because there really is no universally accepted definition of what civic engagement was. So I looked at all the folks who had been writing about it, including the Association of American Colleges and Universities, and I was able to come up with this definition for my study. Civic engagement is defined as maintaining interest and action in one's world as evidenced by active participation in both civic and political matters within one's community, ranging from the local to international domains. So I felt like that was a pretty big net to cast right there. So another sub-theme of the research was the rising cost of higher education and student indebtedness. So that theme was also in the back of my mind as I undertook this research. So I have 4 primary research questions in an effort to establish some benchmarks as it relates to civic engagement in higher education and civic engagement learning. The first question is, in what ways are Chilean public and private for-profit institutions committed to doing civic engagement education in practice? The second question was, what are the prevailing value means? And this is associated to the theoretical framework that I'm using. What are the prevailing value means or worldviews of the Chilean graduate students in public and private for-profit higher education institutions? To what extent is there a relationship between the graduate students' personal characteristics and civic engagement outcomes? And then the last question was, is there a relationship between institutional type and the graduate student civic engagement outcomes? So the theoretical framework that I felt I needed, had to be pretty comprehensive. I was focusing on adult learners. And so what I found in my research, Young, Pinochet, Bukowski, a lot of their research is based upon investigating the developmental aspects of children and adolescents. Claire Graves, who is the author of Spiral Dynamic Theory, was a scholar who worked here in the Northeast Ohio area. He was a criminal psychologist for the city of Cleveland, and he also was a professor at Case. And so he subsequently went on to do his research at Union College in New York. And so I felt that my study needed to have an adult developmental maturation theory. And his theory offered that to me and had the components that I needed. Now, his description of the theory was the emergent cyclical level of existence theory. So now you can see why I got changed to spiral dynamics. Nobody wants to say all that. And so his protege, Don Beck and Chris Cohen, developed a book under which they used Graves' theory and changed it to the spiral dynamics. But the research, the concept, the theory is all from Graves' work with the college students that he was working with. And I actually got trained by Chris Cohen in Santa Barbara prior to going to Chile and using this theoretical framework. So, spiral dynamic theory is an adult maturation framework. It incorporates memetics. And everybody's familiar with the memes we see on social media and pictures, but memes are really a lot deeper than that. Memes are units of culture that get transferred through processes of imitation. And I have a little video I want to share with you about that to help undergird your understanding of memes, because they're an integral part of this framework and how it operates. So also, I felt I needed a theoretical framework that dealt with the evolving ontological worldview of adults. And so people's concepts of reality, people's values, people's understanding of big truth, big T, and little truth, little t. This framework offered that to me. Also, I was interested in seeing how our cognitive capacity moves from a very simplistic neurological orientation to more complex higher order thinking. Also, some of the frameworks that talked about adult development had these stage theories. And so when you think about stages, like Maslow has this hierarchical stage where you reach this point of self-actualization. Keegan has this stage where you reach this higher level consciousness and self-awareness. What I liked about Graves' theory is that it was open-ended, because Graves held that the adult's capacity for learning is open-ended. There is a never-ending quest to understanding existential life. So, Smart Dynamics Theory is one for me. Now, I sent you all have copies, and I also sent this by email. Spiral dynamics theory is a very comprehensive theory, and on first blush, it could seem very complicated, but it really is quite simple and comprehensive. Graves held that we have these two tiers of existence, and that most people, 90% of the population, operate at the subsistence level. In this spiral dynamic theory, you move from a very basic orientation in the world where you just want to meet your basic needs, water, shelter, protection from danger, to an orientation that is more open to ideas of magic and mysticism. So in this orientation, you negotiate, you look for safety, tribalism, and traditionalism. And so you see things like shamans, witch doctors, beliefs in witches and ghosts and demons being the predominant way in which that person views and negotiates the world. Then the next orientation up is the power impulsive, and it has these mnemonic color codes to help associate to the concept. But the red is associated to this power impulsive. So you negotiate and operate in life through your imposition of power and domination. So if one was to think about the feudal systems that existed back in antiquity, that would be the orientation through that particular view. The one with the power has a control, the one with the power imposes itself and will destroy those who oppose him. Then you have this orientation that moves to a more purposeful saintliness. And here you would see themes of absolutism, an actual right way to do something. And in extreme cases, a dogmatic order that one holds as the world exists. So following the rules, obeying authorities, doing what is the right thing at all costs is that orientation. Then you move toward this more strategic materialism, where the person looks to be manipulative and winning in the world, but they don't want to arouse the ire of other people. So you see a kind of cunningness that comes into play with this particular world. And then the next permutation is that of a more humanistic, egocentric kind of orientation. Now, we continue on the scale where you get this kind of understanding of complex system, a more post-modernity orientation. And then you have this more holistic globalism where you start to accept dichotomies, and general life is more important than the individual life. And so this is a fascinating theory for some other aspect of it, the fact that it oscillates between these themes of individualism and collectivism. So when you look at the framework, this right side of the framework, all of these orientations are very individualistic. This side of the framework is very collectivist. Graves held that as we face these existential problems, we oscillate between these orientations as we mature. So we start out very self-centered and individualistic, move toward a collectivist orientation, then face an existential problem that requires higher order thinking that moves us more to individualistic orientation, then back to, oh, did I just lose my light? Then back to collectivism and such and so. So you have a kind of zigzagging on the framework. Oh, I hope I did not lose power with this battery. If anybody has any AA batteries, let me know.
I'm a backup.
Okay, thank you. So, the other thing that was attractive about this framework is Graves held that these systems were subsuming. So, as you move to the next level, you still maintain the worldview and may draw upon that worldview in a regressive nature if you face an existential problem that you don't know how to resolve. So, for example, I gave this example to my students on yesterday. So I said, I'm a parent, and my kid comes home and tells me that the teacher is picking on them. And I say, what? I'm going up to that school and talk to this mom. So the teacher, in the mind of my child, is like, well, that's the authority. They have the power. They're right. It's the school. We have to obey them. And I'm pretty much in agreement with that as well. But I'm also from the hood. And so somebody messing with my child gonna be consequences and repercussions. So I go into this meeting, and initially the meeting starts off, we're very civil with each other, and then the teacher begins to tell me how awful my kid is. Well, I'm not responding very well to that. Voices get raised, things get escalated, it almost comes to fisticuffs. Okay, so in order to resolve that issue, I regress back to what I knew from my community. You defend your own. But what I could have done is been a little bit more strategic and presented myself to the teacher like, I know Johnny isn't always the best he should be. I'm going to give you my personal phone number. If you have trouble with my child, you call me directly. At the same time, I believe my child, but I need to have something happen here because they need to get through that class. So instead, I employ a different kind of approach to this particular teacher, where I don't resort to that more regressive orientation where I'm starting to go in there and box with this teacher. But I still at the same time, okay, let's see. All right. I still at the same time, resolve the issue with my child needing to get through this class. So that's the example I gave them on yesterday. For my purposes, I didn't anticipate too many of my participants believing that the world operated through ghosts and shamans and demons as the predominant orientation that they held. So I focused on these 6 conceptions in my research. So spiral dynamic theory operates within 3 domains, which was really helpful to me because you have these kind of worldviews that exist within the individual, but of course individuals make up organizations. So you can have an organization that can be very absolutist, very dogmatic, or you can have an organization that could be very humanistic, who looks to draw upon consensus and get the input for the greater good of everyone. So that's what I also found as advantageous in the employing of this particular framework. Because I can look at the individual participants in the form of the students and the administrators I interviewed, but I also could look at how the institution operated and also how the society operated. So the next thing I want to talk to you all is about memetics. And so what is a meme and what is memetics? So memetics is a theory and a form of academic study holding that mental contents of culture that we've come to know as memes operate and transfer through non-genetic imitation. Now that's the key word, non-genetic imitation. So I have this video I want to share with you all, and I have a caveat for it because there's some discussion in here about universal Darwinism and primordial soup. I don't hold to those conventions. I'm a biologist, but I do not hold to the idea of a primordial soup being the means by which we came to be in the world. But it has value because I think it does a pretty good explanation of what a meme concept is, because all of us know memes from social media. But memes are larger units than that. They can be an axiom, they can be a song, they can be an idea, they can be a belief system. And what's unique about the meme and how it operates similar to a gene is that it goes through this evolutionary process of replication, variation, and natural selection. The meme, like the gene, looks to survive and maintain its relevance in society. So in comparing memes and genes, I asked my students a question. I said, memes have a survival system that is similar to Darwinian evolution that incorporates the process of replication, variation, and natural selection. So I then went on to show them these pictures. And most of us are old enough to remember when Kentucky Fried Chicken existed, right? Then you have, in 1978, you have this evolution of this cultural progression of the logo. Then we come into the period where we're becoming more health conscious in our nation. So the word fried gets taken out of the name of the chicken. It just becomes KFC. And then you have this cultural progression with the colonel looking less like a plantation owner and more like a friendly Santa Claus. And then you have the 2017 Rob Lowe Kentucky Fried Chicken imagery. And so I asked my students, I said, did any of y'all know that that F stood for fry? None of them knew that. But we all remember when Kentucky Fried Chicken was called fried. There was at one time this representation of what the regular American housewife was. And so we had these images from our Fun with Dick and Jane books. So you had these women surrounded, and our duty was to learn how to cook and you know, be good homemakers. But then you have this cultural evolution where the people in 1950 seeing people like this might even question their sexual orientation. But you have images of women being powerful, being leaders, being outside of the home. Now, as I said earlier, memes are more than just images. They can be ideas and concepts. There was a belief at one time that slaves had no souls. And so, in my argument, the evolutionary process that has happened with that concept, and there is research to support this, in the medical profession, they believe that blacks feel less physical pain than other racial groups. And there's evidence showing that doctors give them less medication. The whole field of gynecology was established on experimentation with anesthetized women, black slave women. So, recently we saw this brouhaha over the Dove body wash campaign on Facebook that they unrolled. So you have this image of this black woman, and she's taking off this shirt to reveal this white woman. People went ballistic about it. So I did my investigation. I said, what in the world is going on? And so I looked at the commercial online, and I saw that after the white woman, she took off her shirt and revealed a Middle Eastern woman. So Dove was so, so anyway, the trope or the meme associated with this has its origins in the idea that historically in the past, black skin was considered dirty. And the way to move it to improve your complexion was to clean that skin such that it appeared as white. So I said, okay, I can understand people make different meanings, but I didn't interpret the representation from that video. And the woman, the black woman in this advertising has subsequently come out and explained what had happened. But you have to be able to take into account the way people make meaning. As a result of this, Dove issued a somewhat apology where they said an image was recently posted on Facebook and missed the mark in representing women of color thoroughly, and we deeply regret the offense it caused. But of course, you know, social media are going to have fun with the image, and this is where they turned it into a meme. So you have the original one, and then you have people producing memes that says when the cops show up to the party and he takes his shirt off and he goes from a black male to a white male. Then you have somebody making a little fun with Michael Jackson with the meme. So that's how memes operate, and they really move very, very quickly in social media, and sometimes very slowly in other kind of formats. So I posed these questions to my students because I said I practiced this presentation with them on yesterday. And I was really interested in seeing what they had to say. So the first one where I talked about, I asked them, I said, if you knew college was free, would you change your major? Or would you be more amenable to doing service learning and volunteerism? Most of them said they would be, because they wouldn't have the anxiety and pressure of paying for it. But they were so focused on getting their degree so they can get work, they didn't feel like they had the time to do some of those more service learning oriented things. And also that I asked them, was any of them aware of the protest movement in Chile and how those students have moved their country toward offering the free education, and none of them were aware of that. So what kind of things did you guys come up with for the first question about student anxiety about indebtedness? Do they talk a lot about that? Each group can share.
Well, I was saying, I mean, that's partly why we built the financial literacy piece into the new first year seminar, because we were, when we were doing the retention work, and I was working with the task force on student communication, like there's all the stuff they need to know, and what are some of the best ways to help them know it. And so we had a little student advisory group that was telling us, well, we don't read our email, and this is a better way to communicate, you know. But one of the things that kept coming up was their lack of understanding and knowledge about how financial aid works, and so that informed in part what we're doing with the first year seminar.
Right. And I told my students in my class about public service loan forgiveness. They didn't know anything about that. That, you know, after 10 years, if you go into a public service job, you can have your loan forgiven. It's even more specific for teachers and police officers, but if you want to be a university professor, you can have loan forgiveness in 10 years if you go into a nonprofit institution. So what about, how do you think poor and low-income families experience the challenge of negotiating educational bureaucracies and the whole business of financing education? What were you guys' thoughts on that question?
That we think that they find it very challenging. That some of them have very little experience. You know, first generation college students are likely, their parents are likely not to have any experience at all.
Right. It's almost like we perpetuate a cycle of privilege, because when you're privileged and you're educated, you know how to negotiate it. Even though when I went back to school to work on my PhD and doing the financial aid papers, I was like, whoa! Because I hadn't been out of the system for so long. But I can only imagine what it was like for someone who was just a total neophyte to that system. Is there value in being an advocate for a core curriculum that promotes civic engagement and service learning? This group, any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you be more detailed how so? How do you define service learning? First, to do that, what do you consider service learning?
So
is it volunteerism?
No.
Okay.
It's much more than that.
Okay.
I mean,
it's almost a payback. You take it out and you not only get the education, but then you pay it forward. You go out in the community and you give to the community. But like you just mentioned, your students are saying, I've got to keep up with what I can keep up with, and I may not have time.
But if it's built to curriculum. What else about service learning or engagement work is unique from volunteering?
well, for me, and then that's, you know, the core curriculum, that there's a clear message and connection between the outcomes of the learning and the education to whatever it is that they're doing. It's not just being a good person,
right,
which is also part of it.
Yes.
It's not just being a good person or just the idea of paying it forward or whatever, but the fact is that they see a connection between your education here at Ursuline is supposed to help you do this, 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 and this, and here's an experience that ties to that, and we help them see very clearly and explicitly the relationship between those outcomes and what it is that they're doing.
Yes, merging the technical with the real world, is that kind of like that?
Well, not only that, but I mean that they see, you know, for example, you know, one of our important learning outcomes is taking responsibility for society. And, you know, and that is defined as feeling the obligation to act in response to unjust social situations.
Yes.
So how is going out, say, to, I don't know, if you had an accounting student who helped work with low-income people in preparing their tax returns. Now that's just a good thing to do, but how is that related to the learning outcome And how's it related to the learning outcomes of the coursework you're doing in your accounting class?
Absolutely.
So that it all becomes a cohesive and coherent experience,
Right.
and not just this sort of atomized set of what I do in the classroom doesn't really mean anything in the real world, but it's stuff I have to do.
Right. And see, the other thing too, for me, civic and community engagement is even different from that. Because we don't, in civic engagement and community engagement, you don't take the position that you're the expert ivory tower coming into the community. You see the community as a partner in reciprocity. And so you go into the community and you listen to that knowledge, that wisdom that exists out there. And you come together in partnership on behalf of those social justice or things that are affecting the world. So we've taken our gifts and offerings to the community in a sort of benevolent manner. But engagement is different from that, where we see there is knowledge for us to be gained too, and having our ear to the ground of the community.
You go in with a sense of humility, that
Yes.
I have as much to learn from you as you can learn from me.
Very, very good.
And I'm bringing a set of skills and knowledge, but I also recognize you have a set of skills and knowledge, and we need to bring those together.
From your having that lived experience in the environment every day. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, in public health, that framework is called a participatory community framework.
Yep, that is.
It's
That
great
is
to hear about it in other groups, so that's cool.
Awesome. Okay, so should we frame the pursuit of college education and job skills as equal to developing global citizenship and social justice? I did not find that a priority of the for-profit universities. And so, and I actually see even not-for-profit ones moving away from that paradigm, because we've been so obsessed with giving our students skills so they can get a job. And so, what is our obligation to make sure that my students know that students in Chile protested for free education and got it? Yeah. Okay, and the last question, how do we as faculty and staff help students explore more deeply their socio-political agency as citizens? Anybody have something for that? I know.
We were kind of talking generally about how important it is as part of the whole ambiance, and not just curriculum, but like co-curricular, and the fact that our students, for the most part, tend to be so busy with their jobs, the courses that they're taking, helping out with the family, so many things like that, that it seems that many of our students are very unaware of what's going on in the world.
And I think what Dr. Pavino talked about, because I teach one of the Ursula USP courses, my students love the fact that I brought this content to them. But I did it within the environment that they're learning. So it wasn't like extra time outside of school. Right. So, you know, working that into our curriculum is so important. And so it allows us to kind of double dip of sorts, you know, and give them a more robust educational experience. Anybody else want to add anything? Okay. So let me get to my next section with my findings. So as I said, I could actually do a whole workshop just on spiral dynamic theory. So I wanted you to see how these memes come together in the formation of these, whoa, it's not my clicker. Okay. In the formation of these kind of meta constructs. So you can see easily the role of women from this particular mimetic perspective, the role of women from this one, from this one, from this one. But one might see women as more traditional, and you know, you might find in instances of abuse how women feel like they have to obey their husband, and if the husband socks them, they just need to act right. Somebody who might be going to their pastor, and their pastor saying, well, you got to obey your husband. You know, Lord have mercy. And so, and then you have this situation here where he's like, I'm out of here, dude. I got a prenup. I did that on purpose. You know, and so these memes can be associated to a variety of concepts that come together to form this memeplex that is associated with how you view the world, how you encounter problems, and how you negotiate them. And as I said, I focused on these 6 primary, and there was an underlying hypothesis to this study as well. I felt that I would see more individualism at the private for-profit university, and as a result of that, less civic engagement among that population. So, my study was a mixed method study, and then it had two parts. The first part was qualitative. And we know that the paradigms of qualitative analysis are that it's an interpretive method. So you're interpreting, and subjectivity is welcomed there. And so what I did is I did focus groups with graduate students, and I did face-to-face interviews with the administrators. I got the interviews professionally transcribed, and then I went about the business of interpreting the interview content in relationship to my theoretical framework. So I developed clusters of thinking based upon how they responded to my civic engagement protocols. Then in the second part of the study, I did a quantitative survey, an online survey self-administered, that I sent to 3,000 students, and I collected 202. Which, according to the Pearson calculation, was sufficient for my study. So this survey I actually designed myself. And so I had 15 constructs, 15 items for each one of the 6 constructs I was looking at. And then I had 20 civic engagement questions. So I took the data that I collected, and I actually did this afterwards, because I started getting into in vivo software. And I love NVivo. NVivo is a qualitative software where you can actually take text data and input it into the computer, and it helps you kind of sort and organize the data. Now, it doesn't do your coding. You still have to do your own coding. But I used it in order to look at how the frequencies of themes showed up in the transcripts. So I was able to create these awesome word clouds, and I could see the words that predominated for each one of the administrators and what kind of themes I could potentially focus on in the research. And so this was the word cloud created from the public university administrator, and then the one from the private high-level university administrator. I did the same thing with the focus group data that I did with the graduate students in part 1. Now, what I was running into is that Chile had a little bit different organizational structure than we have in the United States as far as degrees. So initially I wanted to just look at graduate students, but I couldn't get enough people. So I looked at any student that was an adult who had already obtained their degree. So we ended up having more postgraduates in the second part of the study, but these are all people who had already received their first college degree. So in addition to those word clouds, it also allows you to do these tree maps. So this is just my little side advocacy for NVivo software and how awesome it is. But it really was helpful because it gave me a visual representation of my data, which is typically what you want to, the approach you take with qualitative data. However, for my quantitative data, I looked at these constructs and I did some ANOVA tests, I did some distribution frequencies, and I did some descriptive statistics. And I also looked at these themes in terms of individualism and collectivism. And what I also coded, I'm going to step back a minute, I coded my transcript data using continuous scale of no civic engagement and very high civic engagement. For the graduate students, they actually filled out a profile form where I asked them the political affiliations and stuff like that. And I asked them to rate their civic engagement levels before we started the discussion and then after we started the discussion. And it was interesting that after the discussion, most of the ones at the private for-profit universities felt that their civic engagement had declined prior to when they entered university study. So here's an example of one of the sample questions that I use with the administrators. And my approach is use people's exact words. So their natural language is Spanish, so sometimes the English was a little broken. So the question was, could you please begin by sharing with me your own definition or understanding of what civic engagement entails? And so I looked at the text and I gave a coding, an attribution code of the spiral dynamic mimetic color associated with the content. And then also I gave them a civic engagement code, even though my research didn't really ask about the civic engagement of the researchers, that asked about the civic engagement of the postgraduates. So In Skinner, the public university administrator's response to civic engagement, he said, I think civic engagement, in my definition, could be the degree of understanding and compromise of either people or institutions regarding the development of one's society in politics, politically, economically, socially, to the extent I am involved or willing to compromise the development of society regionally or nationally. There were so many things of collectivism and what he had to say there. Compromise, being concerned about the group dynamic, society, etc., etc., etc. So I coded him a dominant green for this particular piece of data. Now here's the response from the private for-profit university administrator. Well, for example, I'm from Talca. I'm not from Talca, excuse me. Talca is this little town in Chile. I'm from Santiago. If you listen to Chileans, they say Santiago is Chile. So it's kind of like this class dynamics, like I'm a higher level Chilean because I'm from Santiago and not this little dinky horse town of Talca. So I'm from Talca. I'm not from Talca, I'm from Santiago. And I came here 5 years ago, and I'm not only involved in my job, but I am also very worried about what happens in the community. And I participate in other things, not for money at all, but there were some things he did for money. He was clear to let me know that. But trying to help other institutions. All of those I statements were so different from what the public university administrator said. And his mention of money and materialism and status. That was so spiral dynamic orange. But he did have that element of green in there because he talked about he worried about the community. I would have to go deeper to say what was your worry about not having access to resources in the community. But so I coded that the orange with a hint of green in his orientation. And so I did that with all of the text data, and so I got these clusters. And so I did the qualitative part first because I didn't want to subconsciously be influenced in my interpretation by the statistical part, but I was happy with the results because they were consistently the same. So here, I did a frequency distribution of those civic engagement questions on the survey that were statistically significant. So that involved voting in student elections, protesting and demonstration frequency, discussing politics with family, and weekly volunteer hours. On all of those metrics, the not-for-profit universities were higher in their civic engagement involvement than the private for-profit university. Now, out of this data emerged this mixed university. As I had said earlier, Chile has these 27 traditional universities who receive direct funding from the state. This university, when I did my research trying to find out which ones were in the public versus private domain, they listed themselves as private but not for profit. The other ones were public state universities, but they were private and not for profit. The solidly for-profit university had institutional stakeholders, not board of trustees or anything like that. So they had shareholders, so they were definitely profit-based, and they were not a part of this Crunch organization. This school was inside the Crunch organization, so I had to give it a different designation, so I called it a mixed university. So what was important to me is that both of the institutions who define themselves as not-for-profits were higher in their civic engagement outcomes. So in terms of my 4 research questions, there was no formal civic engagement curricula or administrative plans at either of the Chilean for-profit or public universities that I interviewed in part 1 of the study. They actually were looking to the United States as exemplars for them on how they might do that in the future. In this sample, for-profit universities statistically evidence greater orientation toward individualism. They also showed higher order thinking on a higher degree than the other institutions. And I had some theories about that as well. So in the sample that I collected, The private for-profit universities were more individualistic, but they also held higher order thinking at their institutions. This was consistent with the Part 1 qualitative clustering of individualism that I saw among the graduate students. So I also saw that individualism orientation higher among the graduate students in the focus group as well. The multiple regression analysis showed that the most influential predictors of protest and demonstration behavior was the participants' orientation toward blue, orange, and yellow. Blue is collectivist, orange and yellow are more individualistic. And salary was another indicator of their tendency to be engaged in protest behavior. As salary increased, protest behavior decreased. The salaries were highest among those at the private for-profit university. Student election voting frequency was most influenced by the type of institution. So those who had the higher frequency of voting in student elections were those who attended the public universities. So the frequency of volunteer hours was really disproportionately higher at the mixed university. But I did a 2x2 categorical table, and I saw that the mixed university students had described themselves more often than not as full-time students. So I interpreted that those students were not working adults that had families and probably had more time to be engaged in civic, service learning type volunteering activities. But it really would take more research and maybe some structural equation modeling to find that out for sure. So here are some of the limitations of my study. As always, when you do research, sometimes people don't show up. So I was supposed to have like 5 people in each group. So for my focus group, so I had like 2 in one and then 4 in the other. So that was a bit of a limitation as it relates to the traditional public university. I really would have liked to have more people be in that particular focus group. But I still got good quality data, I felt. And also I used some trustworthiness techniques that you use in qualitative analysis, and I would go back and I would talk to them and repeat to them what I heard them say and ask them to confirm what I heard them say. So I was very diligent in making sure that the data was robust. And also I had a video recording which was helpful because I could go back and literally interpret reactions because I had the visuals there for me in the, from the focus group interviews. One of the things I would probably do, and I thought maybe a weakness, is to re-examine the survey items using IRT techniques. Because I had 20 civic engagement questions, but in terms of the 3 types of institution, only 4 of them were statistically significant. So I would re-examine those as well, and maybe use IRT techniques to make sure that I'm really getting a civic engagement variables. The highly collectivist nature and social context of Chile was a limitation. There is an index, a Hofstede index of dimensions of culture, and it rates every nation by its collectivism and individualism, among other things. And Chile is like among one of the most collectivist societies in the world. So I would really like to replicate the study somewhere like here in the United States, because we're like one of the highest, most individualistic countries in the world. So I think it would be an interesting contrast to have that opportunity to look at this study, repeat this study in another context. Some of the implications are that the research offers deeper insights to adult cognitive thinking patterns, which I felt like was a really valuable outcome of the study, and how they solve problems and how they connect civic engagement and higher education. The theoretical framework is a useful guide for possibly student development programming, and also for assisting in leadership style recognition and organizational strategic planning. If you have a very absolutist, dogmatic orientation within the organization, then you might look at other kind of approaches in trying to engage people in productive ways. I want to explore more deeply this concept that came up in the study that I've dubbed educatedness. And I fought with my committee about this word. I said, well, Paul Freire can create conscientization. That's not a real word. I can make one too. And so in Spanish, it's educadudad. And so it's this concept that emerged from the data that attention to social justice themes in connection to social mobility goals in higher education seem to decrease when the focus of the individual was on social mobility. So I'd like to explore that more deeply from the research. So that's pretty much it, what I had to share with you all. And thank you so much for your time and attention. And if there's any questions or feedback, I'd love to have it at this time. You got 8 minutes. Thank you. Did y'all enjoy that? Did you learn anything? Okay, good. Great. Well, feel free to shoot me an email if you'd like to share your thoughts or if you want to say anything here. Or if not, you're free to go.
Could you go back one more slide?
Oh, I'm sorry?
Your slide before.
Oh, okay.
Can you see your second point down, the STD framework? Mm-hmm. Can you see that within an office structure?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because people bring their, these constructs of the framework are meta-worldviews. And those worldviews are developed as a function of these tiny memes that go into how they view the world or their sense of reality and their values. So it's a paradigm. The worldview essentially is a paradigm. It's a paradigm of what that individual at that stage in their life values, what they believe to be true, what they believe to be reality. And they negotiate and problem solve based upon that posture.
This may be a question that's, beyond the scope of our discussion, but I was just curious as to the developer of this SDT. Mm-hmm. And that's a very dangerous acronym.
I know it is. It got dangerous in my dissertation.
I have to be really, really careful there.
I always say spiral dynamic.
Yeah.
That kept my word count down.
On what population were these findings based on?
These are his college students and adult learners.
Okay, but I guess my question is, for example, William Perry, who inspired the Women's Ways of Knowing, developed this really compelling description or paradigm of how students learn and develop, but it was all based on white male Harvard students. So I wondered, was this theory based on a broader and more, maybe you don't know.
I do know.
I'm guessing.
Yeah, I do know. That's a very good question. And that was one of the critiques of the theory because he didn't have a lot of diversity, but he did have a lot of females. The students came from his abnormal psychology class at Union College. Okay. So he had a good amount.
I was just curious as to, because I'm always careful when these very neat paradigms of how people learn or develop or grow, where does that come from and what was the sample that these conclusions were drawn from, and are they broadly applicable or not?
And I absolutely can appreciate that. One of the things I loved about this theory is it's the fact that it was dynamic and that the systems were subsuming. Mm-hmm. So he felt that people's orientation is about 60% in one particular mode, but they also are exiting one and entering another. Mm-hmm. So you have this dynamic reality of how this person is viewing the world, but he did feel that there was a dominant orientation for all of us as we move to the next level. And he also held that change was not inevitable, that a person can live out their existence with one particular worldview and they have no desire to change. Homer Simpson, and there'd be no desire to change whatsoever. Now, he did talk about, because he didn't really talk about disease or abnormal psychology, he made an emphasis these were normal, healthy adults that he was looking at. And he did talk about there being quantum leaps, but he said that there was instability with that. So if a person went from red to orange instead of going through the blue phase, he said that would create an instability, that they would likely drop back down to the station that was below that. So going from red to orange was possible, but it's usually a very unstable type of orientation in that person.